Welcome to Off the Shelf. I'm your host, Yvonne Wolf. Today we have two guests from the Alliance Française of the North Shore, Margot Steinhart and Bill Sand. They are both Glenview residents who worked on a World War II memoir as a group project. So, Margot, can you tell us more about your project?
The project that was undertaken by the Alliance Française of the North Shore is actually a two-part project. It starts with a video and then evolved into becoming a collection of stories, of personal stories of our members who were children during World War II. What I think is fascinating is that so many of our members and those who contributed to this project grew up in other countries. Only two of the people are really American citizens by birth. The others are folks who have come to the Chicago area and to the North Shore and are part of their stories, are part of this. There were stories from 5 different continents, 14 different people contributed to this. Our video started out with 5 people who were selected to tell their stories as a narration. And the narration evolved into a bigger project of stories because we realized very quickly, even during, I think, the videotaping of that particular program, that we had a lot more stories to tell from our members. So that was really the genesis of starting our project. One of our members thought that this would make a good program for the Alliance Française, and it was from there that we decided that we'd actually videotape the project so that it would, we really wouldn't lose the stories that were being told. And we wanted to share those with our members who couldn't attend or family members who weren't there either. So that was the start for that particular project, which of course we did in French. And then we worked with members from our group to do the translations and then also the subtitles for the videotape. So we ended up with a project of 75 minutes, which has about 10 minutes each for our 5 people who are telling their stories from World War II, and then question and answer that forms the rest of the video. And from there, we requested volunteers from among our members to contribute their stories, which they wrote out, and we've put together so that we have different stories that are in French and in English. Everything that was written in French to start with is translated into English. So we have 17 stories in English, in French rather, and then 23 stories which are in English as part of this.
And Bill, you were a panelist?
Yes, I was one of the 5.
And can you tell us a little bit about your story?
Well, my story was that of growing up in Belgium during World War II, which started in May of 1940 and of course ended with the Americans liberating Belgium in September of 1944. So, and my recollections of some of the more salient points, I remember it all vividly, but you know, it's hard in 10 minutes to tell the story of 4 years. So that was it. I did the best I could to remember some of the more salient points, and more dramatic, I suppose, and some not so dramatic.
Well, you were 11 at the time?
No, I was about 8.5 when the war started, and 13 at its end.
And you
so
went from...
old enough to remember.
Yes. You traveled many miles in those years.
Well, yes, I traveled many miles, but not of my own choosing. You know, when the persecution of the Jews started in about May or June of 1942, some Belgian, mostly Catholic organizations took the children in hand and shuffled them around between, you know, convents or boarding houses, farms, private families, etc., etc. And we didn't ask too many questions.
Yes. Well, Margot, did you have a story to tell personally, or were you more you were coordinating them?
I was a project coordinator. My side of the family has really has been in the United States for a long time, almost back to the the Mayflower, but not quite. And so this was not something that directly touched my family, except that my husband came from, was in a displaced persons camp during the World War, and so his family came over with his mother and aunt. So I experienced that experience through the stories, as perhaps also my son, who is an historian as well, and has recently written a book based on his dissertation research in Germany and in England and France and Russia and the United States, have put together. So there's been a certain fascination with that story.
Yeah.
So it's a little different perspective from which I've come to this story, but an appreciation that this is really a great honor to be able to share these stories, and it's something that we really have to be able to share. Some of our stories do relate directly to the Holocaust, but others relate really to everyday life of families that were affected by what was going on in their own countries during that time.
You mentioned there's Pacific Front to the war too, and I think there's one of the contributors in Denmark, and so your project, you said that your project took 10 months to complete. What took the longest time to do? Was the translation perhaps, or maybe?
There were long parts of, and most of them were going, these parts were going on simultaneously. Mm-hmm. We were doing the translation, which did take a bit of time. We had to transcribe it first, which means just simply writing down what we thought we were hearing, double checking those things, and then trying to do translation, and then going from the translation to subtitles, which have to be short, yes, just by virtue of keeping up with the speed of the speaker. So that was a lot of work and checking and correction.
It's not as easy as people think, right?
No, it's not. It's not as easy as one might think. And then to double check to see about certain facts, because it's easy to misspeak. It's easy to for example, when people are speaking, they don't necessarily follow chronological order.
That's true.
So you have to try to piece that back together. What is the flow and what was the next step and so on. But that was, the stories really were so dramatic and so interesting in themselves that going back over and over many times with the project was really very satisfying to do that. And then, of course, working with the videographer to try to make things sure that the parts were in sync and that the adjustments were made, and then to get that ready for a presentation, because we wanted to show the video just prior to D-Day last year for the 70th anniversary of D-Day, and which we did, and did show that at the Glenview Public Library with the guests of about 100 people, including the French Consul General and the Belgian Honorary Consul General,
yes,
and the Quebec delegation head. So it was an event that was really important, and we were continuing at the same point with the collection of stories. And even with the stories where people had written their stories, we still had to go back and do some checking and to make sure that the connections that were being shared, that was really the right order and that were being interpreted in the same way.
That must be very hard, because sometimes we all know children memory could be not as clear as they might be very clear, but not the age perhaps they think they were, or unless someone, right? Do you feel that is a difficulty?
I think I was starting from the standpoint that it was really important to tell their story and their memories. And we all know that memories are certainly, this question of being true to actual facts. Sometimes that's interpretation, based on certain experiences in certain places, and sometimes details get a little murky. But I think we really tried to keep with the stories that were being told, and with the way that the people were telling them, trying to keep their style. Because first of all, the first 5 stories in our collection, the booklet themselves, are based on what was done in the videos themselves. They're not, and some of the stories were changed a bit by the authors themselves, by the people who were in the video. Others, it was a question of clarifying. So we really wanted to keep their voice, and we also wanted to keep their the way that they're speaking. I think what's interesting too is that this was done in French, and for most of the speakers, French is not necessarily the native language or the maternal language. It may have been one that was acquired at a certain point in time, sometimes through family, sometimes through studies themselves, studies or perhaps living in a country. So it's the interesting thing is that to have so many people who can actually speak about their life and times in that period of time in French, and to share that.
Yes, I would imagine that being to recall it in French might bring up more nuances of that memory than in English, even the language you use.
And for many of these people, English is not a first language either. So that's, I think, is another interesting part of this whole project. We're really talking about people who are providing their stories through perhaps a second, third, or fourth language that they have learned or acquired.
Do you find perhaps their French could be antiquated because they learned it when they were in that age, or that time, or not as modern French, perhaps?
I think it was more a question of formality to some extent. One of the aspects which came up in the stories as well as in the video that a couple of our folks referenced, and Bill was one of them, was talking about the Israelites or the Israelites.
Yes,
and this is something that I had heard of earlier too, of how Jews were referred to back in that period of time. And it was a question of social acceptance. One didn't really refer to the Jews per se, but one referred to the Israelites. And today, of course, that is a word that's not really used so much. It's got a different connotation as opposed to the Jews. And of course, that came through with the armbands and the stars of David with the stories that were told. But for the most part, I would say that the language is more of a formal language, which is what basically students learn. They learn a certain language that would be acceptable today or yesterday. We're not quite talking about people talking as Molière did, but we're really talking about 20th century, and the vocabulary is certainly understandable. I think one of the more challenging parts are the references, because one of the purposes of really working in this project too was thinking, being a teacher, I really want to be able to share this with students and other French teachers as well, or teachers of history, or those that are working on that period of time. And this is certainly a very important time to be talking about World War II because of the anniversaries that are still coming here with the end of World War II and Victory in Europe Day. And so the question of really working through this process, I think, was very important.
And Bill, from hearing other people's stories, how do you feel from?
Well, everyone's story was similar, but not quite similar. And to address your question about the French, French is my native tongue, but I've been in the United States for some 60 years, and for the better part of 50 of those 60, I spoke French very, very rarely. Now I speak French more often because since I joined the Alliance, but I wish I'd done that 30 years ago instead of 3 years ago, of course. But everyone's story was different, you know, the circumstances in which they grew up, their family situation, the extent of their religious experience. And incidentally, 3 of the 5 panelists were Jewish. So it wasn't all, I don't think this was meant as a Holocaust remembrance as much as a war remembrance, and it just worked out that way. But everyone's story was moving, similar in some ways and very dissimilar in other ways. So just everyone has a story.
Well, I suppose the similarities may be separation and reunions and being relocated and having to trust people who...
Absolutely, especially children, because adults also had to trust friends. To go back to that era for a moment, they were also good friends and some organization who tried to help adults. My mother survived, but we didn't see one another for some 2.5 years. And I did not know if she was alive, being shuffled from here to there, and she did not know if I was alive. There was no way of corresponding or keeping track. That was a very dangerous thing to even attempt to do.
Can you tell us a little bit about this adult that you had to trust?
Yes. Well, this is a book that I discovered by accident through a good friend of mine. As a matter of fact, it's a funny anecdote. My friend Marcia had taken the book out of the library in Morton Grove because there's a chapter on Hungary. And her husband is of Hungarian descent, and so she was interested in reading. And one day she said to me, "Oh, Bill, I just got this book. There's a chapter on Belgium. Would you like to see it?" And I said, "Sure." I opened the book on the chapter in Belgium, which is here somewhere, and I started reading. And in the first chapter, it said something about Father Bruno, or Père Bruno in French.
Yes.
And I saw Father Bruno. I closed the book. I looked at the cover, and I said, "Marcia, that's me." And she says, "No, it's not." And I said, "Marcia, I tell you, that's me." And of course, but I had not looked at the cover when she handed me the book. I just went straight to the chapter on Belgium. So it tells a story about Father Bruno probably saving the lives of some 400 children, and I was among them. So and of course I remember some of the particular places where he put us, and then moved us, and we were being moved around because of reasons that we weren't aware of. It was either, I don't think I personally was ever moved from one place to another because of bad behavior, but things were maybe getting too hot with the Gestapo being aware of some, goings on that they didn't like, or maybe someone who had taken the burden of a couple of children found it difficult to make it. This was the war. Everybody was having problems. And so we were being moved around and just went with the flow, so to speak.
So Bill, tell me more about Father Bruno. What happened to him? Or
he passed away in the early 80s, and he had problems during the war because at one time the German authorities, the Gestapo, was aware of what he was doing, and he had to drop the uniform and just go into hiding himself. Now, Father Bruno is one of many, many people who was honored in Israel at Yad Vashem as a righteous among the nations. And of course, I don't know how many people in Belgium were so honored, but that takes in people who helped the Jews during the war in many, many, many countries, including Germany, incidentally. There were some people in Germany who risked their lives to help, Jewish people. So Father Bruno was so honored.
That's true. That's very touching to know. And Margot, can you tell us a little bit about the photographs and the process of getting permission and to use them? Because some of our audience are aspiring writers, and they might be collecting their own materials for the memoir of World War II. And pictures are, sometimes you have to find them, and how do you use them?
One of the goals that we were trying to do, especially with the video as well as with the booklet, was to find vintage pictures of our participants. And in some cases, people did have period pictures, and in others there really was no photo that could be found. And then also to pair that up with a contemporary photo as well, to give a sense, I think, for those who are reading the stories, that we really are talking about young people. And even though they're the memories of those who are our senior citizens at this point, those memories date from when they were children. Most of the photos then came really from our members themselves. Bill's was one of the exceptions of where we had to really dig a bit to try to figure out where this photo, who had the rights to the photo. Mm-hmm. And this came about really by connecting up with the Holocaust Museum, the U.S. Holocaust Museum, which had the rights for this photo. And we were able to get that for the size that we needed for our video at no cost. So otherwise there are other costs that might be involved in doing this kind of research. But we were able to get that particular video and use it in our project as both the video as well as the print.
Was it a lengthy process? And
Once we figured out where the photo was and who had the rights, that went fairly quickly.
And that itself, the research, where is the photo, or I see, can be very difficult. For your event at Glenview Library, you mentioned the 70th anniversary of World War II. You mentioned that you had props for that talk that day. What kind of props?
It was more the props for actually the videotaping that we had done in January for recording the program itself with our 5 panelists. The program at the Glenview Public Library was really a celebration, and it was a screening for about 100 people, along with we had speakers. We had a representative from the village of Glenview, Don Owens, who came and spoke about his Navy background because of the military significance of D-Day, as well as having the French Consul General and the Belgium Honorary Consul General and the head of the Quebec delegation in Chicago. So they each had their own views of looking at World War II, and I think most Europeans, and of course the Canadians, entered World War II much before the United States did. So the souvenirs and the remembrances of World War II, I think, are even stronger than for those of many Americans. Although many Americans of my generation had parents and relatives who fought in World War II, were part of that. Or grandparent, as of my son, with looking back at a grandparent and realizing that that was the period in time that he was also serving.
You say this is a project that involved all your members, and you say your husband helped you very much too. And I know you did much of the editing and translation.
He was very helpful in terms of getting some of our props that we needed for our videotaping, as well as doing the photography work that we needed for our booklet to be able to take, because many of our members did not necessarily have these vintage photos were not digitized. No. So he did the work in digitizing them, and then also taking, for example, Bill's photo and being able to extract just Bill for our booklet. And so that was extremely helpful in terms of the work that he did.
This is a wonderful material that you have on DVD and the pamphlet. I think it's very educational. Where can students or families who want to hear the program, where can they get this?
We have donated a copy of the video and also the collection of stories to the Glenview Public Library. So there is a copy there, and those who would like to have their own personal copy, which is available through by contacting us through our email, which is alliance, ALLIANCE, FN, @yahoo.com.
Well, we're very happy to have you on our special program.
Thank you very much for your interest in this project.
And thank you for joining us, and I hope you see us again next time.